This one's a classic.
Old School MapleStory's class design can, at times, leave a lot to be desired. For example, there aren't many classes in Old School MapleStory who had the tools required to compete in the single-target DPS category in any meaningful way. Night Lords simply dominated this field, leaving every other class in the dust. This was the case for a very long time. That is, until Corsairs were released in version 62. Pirates were the first new job ever added to MapleStory, and the hype surrounding their release was truly unreal. Everyone was eager to see what they'd bring to the game that, up until now, had only featured 4 jobs with a total of 10 classes. 11 if you count beginners. Corsair's contributions to the meta of Old School MapleStory are, like most classes, often overshadowed by the big names. But this class dealt insane damage, and they were the first to consistently compete with Night Lords in single-target DPS, even outdamaging them at times, all without the need for any external buffs. Corsair's story is unlike any other, with fascinating and unique combat mechanics, plus crazy damage output that served as their reward for the brutal grind that they had to endure in order to reach 4th job. The story of Corsair can be confusing, with many unanswered questions. Today, I hope to lift the veil that this class finds themselves behind so frequently, and explain how they almost entirely dethroned the most powerful class in the game, nearly acquiring that title for their own. So, what was Corsair like in Old School MapleStory? I find exploration in these games to be the most fascinating part of the experience. I used to switch classes constantly because I loved learning about them and seeing firsthand what they had to offer. A while ago, I found this game on Steam called Eidolon that I found has a very interesting world of its own, one that I've been enjoying discovering myself. The mix of idle game and MMO elements fascinated me, so when they offered me a sponsorship deal, I very graciously accepted. I've been playing both idle games and MMOs for years, so a game that combined the best aspects of the two sounded perfect. Eidolon allows me to make forward progress on my account even when I'm not actively playing, and it has secrets of its own to discover. There are a ton of classes in Eidolon, for example, and I'm constantly learning more about them as I progress. I've been really enjoying my barbarian actually. There's nothing quite like crushing huge groups of enemies with my bear attack. Eidolon doesn't demand nearly as much of my time as other MMOs, and that's extremely valuable to me these days. I'm a busy person. I can't play games as much as I would like to. Eidolon is available on both iOS and Steam, so I can hop in game on my phone to check up on things, and whenever I'm at my computer, I can launch the game through Steam, and my account is seamlessly saved to the cloud, which is super convenient. You can play Eidolon for free on Steam using the links posted in the description and the pinned comment. Thanks again to Eidolon for sponsoring this video. Since Pirates weren't released until well into the game's life, there's no story to be told of their beta presence. They simply didn't have any. Pirates were dropped into Old School MapleStory right around its peak in late 2008. By this time, 4th Job was already available. People were actively killing Horntail, selling the exclusive mastery books for a pretty penny, and they were maximizing their secondary stats from gear in order to get the greatest benefit out of Maple Warrior. And this is where our story begins. Say hello to our future Corsair, Ain't OG. Eager to level and enjoy the perks of the class over the very expensive Night Lord, there was still an incredibly tough and tiresome road ahead. Future Corsairs enjoy a road filled with slow leveling, low damage output, and an extended period of time spent awaiting the power spike that they would eventually receive. When you envision leveling a character from 1 to 10 in Old School MapleStory, it's likely you imagine defeating snails and delivering letters in Amherst on Maple Island. For magicians, they probably don't imagine leveling all the way to 10, and instead remember it as a bit of a struggle to get through these levels with their base stat of Int. Luckily for pirates, there's little concern of damage output before level 10, regardless of the path they choose. Knuckle pirates, future buccaneers, have the luxury of strength, and even gun pirates, like our future Corsair, enjoy a little bit of damage from their primary stat of Dex. After finally finishing her time on Maple Island, tending to the islanders' needs, Ain't OG heads to Chiron in the Victoria Island port city of Nautilus Harbor to receive her first job, officially making her a pirate. A pirate's first skill is bullet time, a skill that passively increases both accuracy and avoidability. For gun pirates specifically, this skill isn't all that valuable. It doesn't unlock any other skills, so it can be skipped without too much penalty. However, as we'll soon learn, a future gunslinger doesn't have all that many skills that they need to level, so bullet time is usually maxed out by the end of first job in almost all cases. Double shot is the first skill that most future gunslingers will be leveling. It quickly fires 2 bullets at a single enemy, dealing up to 80% damage in its initial implementation. This is actually a particularly low damage multiplier for a first job skill. As of version 62, Rogue's Lucky 7 deals 150% damage, and Archer's Double Shot deals 130% damage. Pirate's Double Shot is certainly underwhelming in this regard, but it does fire very quickly, and this makes it a very satisfying skill to use, if nothing else. Interestingly, Double Shot was given different sound effects for KMS and GMS. I assume this was due to legal reasons, but in GMS, we were given this sound effect. And in KMS, we get this sound effect. Thankfully, we have our tale to fix this silly decision for us in the West. A skill that was traditionally used by knuckle pirates that gun pirates were still able to make use of is Somersault Kick. This is a relatively short-range multi-mob attack, being the only skill besides Warrior's Slash Blast that can hit multiple enemies in first job. Since guns had a minimum distance required to fire, just like a rogue's claw or an archer's bow or crossbow, this skill was actually commonly found on future gunslingers, even though it scaled better with strength, which gunslingers did not have all that much of. The only other valuable skill a gun pirate has in first job is Dash. This is a speed and jump increasing skill that can be activated by double tapping the left or right arrow key, or by assigning it to a button on the keyboard and using it with that shortcut. This skill sounds amazing for a first job skill, and while it is a pretty valuable skill, it only lasts up to 20 seconds at a time, and it will deactivate itself earlier than that if the player stops moving or turns around. Gunslingers in particular certainly wanted this skill, as it was an incredibly valuable part of the mobility that they would possess in the future. Being an on-demand increase in speed was helpful, but not as amazing as something like Assassin's Haste. A future gunslinger's skill build might just be the simplest out there. Max double shot and then add points into whatever you want, usually dash for mobility and then bullet time for the added avoidability. It was also possible for a gun pirate to utilize Somersault Kick as a first job training skill like I mentioned, but maxing this skill would require taking points away from bullet time, as double shot was necessary for a third job skill in the future, so you can't take points away from it without seriously hindering your character. Somersault Kick would, however, allow training on monsters without worry of a gun's minimum distance requirement, and ultimately, losing a few points from bullet time wasn't the worst thing in the world. Double shot is an interesting skill when compared to other ranged attackers' single-target first-job attacking skill, in this case Lucky 7 and Archer's Double Shot. Pirate's Double Shot fires quicker than Lucky 7, about 37% quicker, but requires only half the MP. At first glance, this makes it seem as though it's an insanely strong skill, but considering its weak multiplier, this quicker attack speed and lower MP consumption is actually a balancing decision that just brings them more in line with other ranged attackers, rather than elevating them above other ranged attackers, as it appears to be on paper. We all know that training in first job really isn't all that complicated. The spots are often identical for every single class without too much variety. You had Pig Beach, Hinnis's Hunting Ground, Ant Tunnel, Wild Boar Land, Sand Bunnies, and Ariant. It's the same story every time. The most interesting discussion regarding first job training is how well each class performed at these common training spots, and a future gunslinger has quite the interesting story to tell in that regard. A gun-wielding first-job pirate was unfortunately given the short end of the stick in many ways. Without the built-in mastery of a rogue's lucky 7 or a magician's magic claw, they had very unstable damage. On top of that, without an archer's critical shot, they had absolutely zero potential to deal high damage to begin with. A gunslinger's greatest identity is how weak and underperforming they were in their lower levels. What keeps them in the game at all in first job is their ability to fire projectiles quicker than any other ranged attacker, as well as their insanely high accuracy, which was understandable given their primary stat of dex. They truly never miss. Despite this, with double shot's low multipliers, it's not all that uncommon for your average gunslinger to hit double-digit damage as late as their early 20s, but hey, I mean, they had a lot of accuracy, so they never missed. They were also somewhat limited by their minimum range requirement to fire their gun, but unlike archers who struggled with this greatly, gunslingers were capable of attacking while in mid-air. As we learned with Night Lords, this is an insanely valuable tool, and when coupled with dash, it was reasonable for a future gunslinger to train just about anywhere. They weren't all that worried about monsters moving too quickly, since they had some decent mobility of their own. They also weren't too concerned with monsters being difficult to reach, though they did have relatively low attacking range compared to claw rogues and archers. Again, it's really just a lack of damage output that holds back a first job gun pirate. A future gunslinger's weapon choice is very streamlined compared to other classes. Pirates, for whatever reason, weren't given level 25 weapons that had faster attack speed like what we see with every other class, at least the classes where attack speed matters. Instead, all a pirate can do is equip whatever the highest level option available to them is, as well as the accompanying ammo. For a first job, the only ammo that a future gunslinger can use is the regular old bullets. While this isn't the first time we've seen projectiles in Old School MapleStory that enforce a level requirement, this is consistent for all bullet upgrades after this, and we'll discuss these as we go. This strict level requirement removes a lot of the potential a gun pirate might have for higher damage output in first job. A star-throwing rogue could, for example, throw Ilbies as early as level 10, giving them an extra 12 weapon attack over Subies. This is an option gunslingers just didn't have. This extra damage would have been very valuable as well, since guns in Old School MapleStory have relatively low base attack values. This low base attack is something that would ultimately contribute to a gunslinger's high damage output later on, in a sort of roundabout way, but with low damage multipliers on their early skills, low base attack, and access to only low-level bullets that had small damage increases, first job gunslingers were not favored by the Old School MapleStory damage formula. The best they could hope for is grabbing a pair of high attack work gloves to bring them up to a level where they were actually capable of dealing decent damage, and hope to not hit too many double-digit lines in KPQ where everyone would laugh at you. After slowly making her way through numerous KPQs and perhaps a few levels spent grinding on sand bunnies, Ain't OG finally reaches level 30 and is allowed to officially become a gunslinger. A pirate's second job advancement is slightly different compared to other explorers. It's a bit more streamlined since Chiron and Nautilus Harbor handles both the advancement and the test, and the items collected are different, but the general idea remains the same. A gunslinger's experience definitely starts to tell a story entirely original starting with second job. They shift completely into a ranged attacking class that feels nothing like their archer or assassin counterparts from this point onwards. Gunslingers have a very fun, unique, and tough journey ahead of them. But these next steps will quickly filter out those who are not worthy of becoming a Corsair. As is often the case, we start out second job with a mastery skill. Gun Mastery, just like Assassin's Claw Mastery, also gives an increase in the amount of ammo per slot, up to 200 extra at max level. This is what actually incentivizes maxing the skill, since the full mastery bonus is given at level 19, a level where the max ammo increase would only be 190 extra bullets per slot. Archers are the only ranged attackers in Old School MapleStory who aren't given this ammo incentive to fully max their mastery skill, since the only difference between level 19 and 20 mastery for an archer is an increase in accuracy, which, as we know, is never useful for ranged classes who already possess the highest accuracy values in the game. Perhaps the most unique and satisfying attacking skill given to gunslingers is Invisible Shot. This skill serves as an AoE mobbing tool, and it does a pretty great job at it. Despite hitting only 3 enemies, it fired quickly, had satisfactory damage, and perhaps most valuable of all, it had a generous hitbox. If this wasn't the case, Invisible Shot would have been a very forgettable skill, but we live in the best timeline where gunslingers were blessed by this arguably good mobbing skill. Next up we have Grenade, a charged skill that fires a grenade a certain distance based on the charge amount. This grenade will hit up to 6 enemies at max level, but it was rarely used as more than a novelty. I believe this skill was intended to be a useful mobbing tool, but when compared directly against Invisible Shot, it falls short. Using it optimally involved a lot of standing around and waiting, which is very antithetical to a gunslinger's playstyle otherwise. Gun Booster should not be a surprising addition to this list of second job skills. It functions as you would expect, putting the 5 attack speed guns down to 3 attack speed, 1 attack speed level away from the cap. Remember this fact for the future. It's a very important bit of information for a Corsair's place in the meta. Next is Blank Shot. Similar to Hunter's Arrow Bomb, Blank Shot is a utility skill that stuns up to 2 enemies temporarily. Unlike Hunter's Arrow Bomb, it doesn't deal very good damage, so it's only really useful for its stunning effect. A good enough skill, but not game-changing. Now we reach one of the most interesting and exciting gunslinger skills: Wings. Back in the day, this skill was the one thing that everyone wanted to try out on Gunslinger. It's a unique mobility tool that no other class has, which allows the player to float in the air for a few seconds, falling far slower for the duration of the skill than one would otherwise. It was a great companion piece for the next skill: Budget Flash Jump. Recoil Shot is a skill that allows the gunslinger to fire their gun, knocking them back a short distance. If used in the air, the knockback would move them quite far, but not as far as Flash Jump would send hermits. Gunslingers were given unique movement tools as early as second job, which really helped them stand out during this era. There was even a technique that could be utilized to cover long horizontal distances very quickly. Since Recoil Shot had a small hidden cooldown between uses, it couldn't be spammed in the same way Flash Jump could. Instead, gunslingers would use dash to increase their speed. They would then jump, turn around, and use Recoil Shot, sending them flying backwards, and then they would use wings the moment they hit the ground, maintaining a large amount of their backwards momentum for the duration of wings. In MapleStory, there's a small amount of time where the player has to decelerate after they stop moving on the ground. The earlier that wings is used upon hitting the ground after obtaining the horizontal momentum that Recoil Shot granted, the more of this momentum could be maintained while floating backwards with wings. This sounds complex, but it's actually a very intuitive technique, one that your average gunslinger could learn in a matter of minutes, and it would increase their potential mobility far beyond that of basically any other second job class. The more jump they had, the better as well, since it would allow them more time in the air with wings. The highest priority skill for a gunslinger is absolutely gun mastery without a doubt. Their main mobbing skill, Invisible Shot, while insanely useful, is not that high priority, because gunslingers find themselves in a unique situation compared to other ranged attackers. Double Shot fired so quickly, it could serve almost the same role as Invisible Shot for a good while, and the stabilization of damage from gun mastery provided such a huge damage increase overall that it was often highly recommended to max it immediately after getting a single point in Invisible Shot, just so you had the option to use it. Throw a few points into Booster, speeding up the already insanely fast Double Shot even further, and gunslingers were effectively using a mini hurricane as early as the mid-30s. After this, Invisible Shot would be maxed, increasing its damage output, followed by a combination of Recoil Shot and Wings. These are the core skills of a gunslinger, and the remaining skills can be maxed as the player sees fit. It didn't really matter all that much what they chose. Blank Shot is a utility stunning skill that would find purpose in certain scenarios, but it wasn't a very high priority skill overall. Besides, Corsairs receive even better crowd control in third job anyway. Generally speaking, a gunslinger's stat build is similar to that of other classes. They can choose between a completely strengthless build, giving them 4 base strength forever, a low strength build that puts their strength somewhere between 20 and 60, allowing them access to the strongest weapons available by early game with the right strength increasing gear, and they could even go normal strength, which was usually not recommended since it was far more optimal to scroll gear to replace the remaining strength requirement rather than adding points directly. Unlike Rogue's Lucky 7, Double Shot didn't have any busted formula that scaled obscenely hard off of dex, so once again the motivation for a long-term strengthless build wasn't present for gunslingers. Most of them simply built low strength and didn't think too much more about it. After Maple weapons were made available for pirates in version 70, the new meta was to build strengthless until third job, where players would then begin adding strength in order to transition to the more powerful end-game guns. This meta resulted in an offshoot of the traditional dexless assassin look that is so iconic. Instead, say hello to the strengthless gunslinger look, just as cool and almost as iconic. Because of Double Shot's ridiculously fast attack speed, gunslingers would also make decent snipers. They could utilize most of the same spots as other ranged attackers, including sniping spots like the single Wind Raider and Crimsonwood Keep Forest. Without Arrow Bomb though, they were usually relegated to slightly more traditional areas until third job. Straw target dummies were an obvious second job training spot, and a lot of options were just so bland. But gunslingers did have one advantage that other ranged attackers did not have: Invisible Shot. It's hard to overstate how massive this skill's hitbox is and how valuable of a tool that is. It allows sniping of monsters in areas like Lab Area C1 from insane distances that other ranged attackers could only dream of. This utilization of Invisible Shot's giant hitbox allowed gunslingers to take advantage of niche spots that other classes couldn't, but there's not much else to say about training in second job. Gunslingers generally conformed to the same areas as other ranged attackers. Just like in first job though, gunslingers were still weaker than their ranged attacking counterparts. Hunters, for example, had critical damage, which made their overall damage output fairly high. Assassins had haste for mobility, whereas gunslingers' dash was slower and clunky. Invisible Shot was a nice mobbing tool for sure, but training a gunslinger was still very tough due to their below-average damage output and their lack of practical mobility. Wings and Recoil Shot were good to have, but with Recoil Shot's hidden cooldown timer, it was not nearly as useful as something like Flash Jump. Gunslingers find themselves in this weird spot in Old School MapleStory, where they're arguably one of the most flashy and impressive classes, but underneath their elegance lies a class who remains somewhat mediocre for a good long time. At the very least, gunslingers unlock new bullets at levels 30, 50, and 70. These are all consistent increases of +2 attack over the previous tier, and this would be consistent throughout the rest of a gunslinger's ammo progression. Unfortunately for gunslingers, there's no Crystal Ilby or Balanced Fury equivalent, and with their lower population compared to hermits, bullets were in far less demand. This often made them cheaper and more readily available to purchase, so bullets were not as much of a prized possession as throwing stars. As it turns out, homogenization and streamlining of mechanics like this can make said mechanics far less memorable for better or worse. Gunslingers were released just a few updates before an anniversary event where maple weapons were made available. While other classes would have had to wait a full year after their release to have access to level 35 and 43 maple weapons, and would then also have to wait a full 3 years before the level 64 maple weapons were released, gunslingers were given access to all of these in as short as 6 months after their release. This meant that after this anniversary update, traditional gunslinger weapon choices that required stats were almost always skipped in favor of the level 35, 43, and 64 maple guns. Every gun after level 35 had the same attack speed value of 5, so attack speed was no longer a consideration after that point. For most gunslingers, it simply came down to optimizing damage output by going strengthless throughout all of first and second job, allowing maximum dex contributions for higher damage output. This, of course, brought them very close to the threshold of being an outright well-performing class. Either way, when you play a gunslinger, there's a lingering feeling as though you're a cut below everyone else, no matter how flashy and fun the class is. This feeling, however, was not permanent, and it would eventually pay off. After grinding away at Wind Raiders and utilizing as many PQs as she possibly could, Ain't OG reaches the coveted level 70, unlocking third job. The path of the outlaw is one that I believe is significantly less well understood than that of the gunslinger. This likely comes down to the fact that most players who didn't have what it took to get through second job as a gunslinger were never going to make it as a third job outlaw. The road doesn't get much easier after third job, something that I'm sure a lot of players were woefully unprepared for, hoping for a boost in power after finally getting through the rough gunslinger grind. The first outlaw skill is Burst Fire, which is an augment for Double Shot that replaces it entirely, disallowing use of Double Shot after Burst Fire has points added to it. Burst Fire increases Double Shot's bullet count to 3 and its damage output to 210% at max level. It's funny how Burst Fire's lower attack speed when compared to Double Shot, which is one of Double Shot's biggest strengths, means it actually deals lower DPS until it reaches level 11. Even as late as version 62, Nexon still hadn't figured out how to avoid creating SP trap skills. Now, if you're anything like me, your first thought when seeing this skill might be, why only 3 bullets when snipers, rangers, and hermits all receive a skill that fires 4 projectiles? This is something I've always wondered. It felt like this decision to give Burst Fire only 3 bullets instead of 4 was a bit of a slap in the face, but it might be justified after we take a look at a few of the other skills in an Outlaw's kit. Octopus is Gunslinger's main summon skill. You summon a little octopus who deals damage for you, and it's very cute. In third job, this skill is very weak and not all that important, but it is used to unlock a fourth job skill that is actually useful, so it's almost always maxed. Then we have yet another summon, Gaviota. Gaviota, much like other third job summons, will follow the player around, seeking out targets within its range, throwing a grenade at whatever it tracks. There are 2 major issues with this skill though, in my experience. First of all, it only lasts for 30 seconds at max level. Secondly, and this one doesn't make any sense to me, whenever it attacks an enemy, it goes away. So you only get to use it 1 time per summon. Third job summons in general are often not that powerful or useful, but Gaviota really took that uselessness to the next level. Of course, just like Octopus, it is used to unlock a fourth job skill, so it's often leveled to 15 for that reason. Flamethrower and Ice Splitter, which we'll discuss in a moment, might provide the explanation for why Burst Fire is such a disappointment of a skill. At max level, Flamethrower will hit 6 enemies with an initial fire elemental damage attack, dealing dot damage for 5 seconds afterwards. Access to elemental damage unlocks some good potential training spots, and I'm a huge fan of elemental damage in Old School MapleStory. I think it's far more useful than people give it credit for. The next elemental damage skill that Outlaws receive is Ice Splitter. This is simply the Ice Elemental mobbing variant of Flamethrower. Ice Splitter, as is the case for most Ice Elemental attacks, will freeze enemies for up to 6 seconds, and this is a very valuable tool. This freezing effect makes Ice Splitter far more useful than Flamethrower, so it's often a very early acquisition for any Outlaw. The final skill in an Outlaw's kit is one that's entirely unique to them in every way. Homing Beacon will fire an egg at an enemy, dealing damage. This will permanently mark the target, and every attack that is used that can possibly hit the enemy after that point will focus on that enemy. This means you can mark a single enemy in a large group, and then any single target attack used will only hit the marked target. As far as I'm aware, this mechanic has never been given to any other class besides Corsair, even as of modern MapleStory. Personally, I think this skill is underrated, and this isn't even its final form. An Outlaw can basically follow one of 2 skill build routes in 3rd Job, single target or mobbing. Neither is noticeably more effective than the other, so it mostly comes down to preference over anything else. Regardless, because of Burstfire's inferior DPS before level 11, it's most effective to save these skill points and then allocate them all at once so that the Outlaw never has a period of time where their single target skill does lower damage than it needs to. Flamethrower is almost always maxed in any build, leaving Ice Splitter at 26. The reason for this is that level 26 is the first level where the freezing effect lasts for its maximum duration, only increasing in damage after that point. Ice Splitter is not the primary damage dealer of the 2 elemental skills an Outlaw has access to, so the incentive to level it beyond the point where it fulfills its primary purpose sufficiently is usually seen as unnecessary. Skipping these last 4 points also just barely allows for maxing Octopus and Homing Beacon, as well as bringing Gaviota up to level 15, all of which are necessary for future 4th Job skills. Outlaws are a bit of a hybrid class in 3rd Job given their elemental attacks. They have superior mobbing capabilities compared to other ranged attackers, so they can choose to either snipe high-level enemies or party up with a priest to grind at Himes, for example. They were actually quite effective there. Sticking to Wind Raiders was often the best choice for the early 3rd Job levels, as the Outlaw would need quite a few skill points added to their 3rd Job skills before they were really all that effective. Unfortunately, Outlaws didn't really have any one-point wonder skills. Outlaws, given their elemental damage, were the best ranged attackers to train at Wolf Spiders, arguably, in my opinion, being the only ranged attacker who could do so effectively. The ability to freeze enemies in general was wildly useful, and probably the one thing that kept Outlaws going through this rough leveling period. And like we see with other ranged attackers, Outlaws are given the luxury of solo bossing, Headless Horsemen primarily. Because of Homing Beacon, Outlaws are easily the best at clearing the Headless Horseman who spawns in hollowed ground. They just throw Homing Beacon onto Headless Horsemen and blast away, completely ignoring the junior wraiths. This is usually done no earlier than the late 80s, once the Outlaw is sufficiently strong enough to reasonably take down this boss. Honestly, Wind Raiders are such a great source of EXP for such a long time, and especially on a class as weak as Outlaw, so it's really not unheard of to go from Wind Raiders directly to Headless Horseman hunting. Level 100 or so is around the time an Outlaw will usually start training at Himes, and this training spot can easily carry them to 4th Job. One interesting alternative in 3rd Job for the element-wielding Outlaw is actually training at Blue Kentauruses, who are weak to fire, and Red Kentauruses, who are weak to ice. An Outlaw's ability to make use of elemental damage makes them one of the few classes who can utilize these monsters for training. I'm not sure how good it was, but they dropped capsules, which we'll talk about in a minute. At this point, most outlaws are still strengthless. The level 64 maple cannon shooter was powerful enough to last well into 3rd job, similar to what we see with hermits. Eventually though, this strengthless build would become unsustainable, and most outlaws would find themselves switching to a regular gun by level 90 once the Peacemaker becomes available. This was the first of the viable endgame gun choices for an outlaw, accompanied by the Concerto, which is a very rare and valuable drop. The Dragonfire revolver, which was only available through crafting or as a drop from Horntail, served as an upgrade to the Concerto, and the Timeless Blindness, the Pink Bean exclusive gun, was usually the final goal for Corsairs pre-Big Bang. Because of how powerful a Corsair would eventually become, coupled with their low base attack value on guns, it was often extremely worthwhile to acquire the strength necessary to equip the highest level, most powerful gun possible. The attack gained from the higher level gun would usually offset the lack of dex that you would have to put into strength in order to equip it. It was possibly more worthwhile to pursue higher level weapons than on any other class in the game. Of course, there was also eventually the VIP gun, but the availability of this weapon was highly restrictive to its use. The 3rd job levels also hold the final ammo types for an outlaw, the level 90 shiny bullets and the level 110 eternal bullets. These are, in typical bullet fashion, just a small increase in damage, and they were widely available for relatively cheap due to their low demand and favorable drop spots. Galloperas, one of the most commonly trained on monsters in this era, and a monster that outlaws could farm very efficiently, dropped eternal bullets like candy. A huge advantage that bullets had over throwing stars also was their stack size, something that would eventually become relevant in bossing scenarios. Eternal bullets stacked at a base maximum of 3,000 per slot, which was increased to 3,200 with full gun mastery. Compared to throwing stars, which stacked up to a maximum of only 1,200 on Hwabis with full claw mastery, this was a significantly larger quantity of reserve ammo, almost 3 times as much. However, while outlaws can carry a massive number of bullets, they never receive a skill that reduces their consumption, whereas Night Lords receive Shadow Star to reduce their star consumption. I believe even with Shadow Star though, bullets do take longer to consume, but I didn't test this. What's interesting about ammo, however, is that outlaws received a unique type of ammo that no other class had called capsules. These capsules functioned identically to other types of ammo, being consumed with every attack and eventually necessitating a recharge at an NPC shop. They came in 2 forms, Blaze Capsules and Glaze Capsules. Blaze Capsules increased the elemental damage of Flamethrower and would only be consumed by that skill, and Glaze Capsules increased the elemental damage of Ice Splitter, again only being consumed when the outlaw would use that skill. These capsules increased the damage of these skills by a whopping 100%, so they were very much worth carrying around for an outlaw who was using these skills often. Eventually in version 99, which was the Chaos update after Big Bang, a new tier of bullets, the Giant Bullets, were added to GMS. To this day, these are still the most powerful bullets available to us, but in other regions, including Maple Sea, armor-piercing bullets were instead released. These 2 bullets possess the same attack value increase, but the Giant Bullets only stack up to 3,200, while the armor-piercing bullets stack up to 4,000. Finally, after enduring Gallopera hell for 20 levels, the painful grind for our little Corsair is finally nearing its end. 120 levels of being an underperforming niche class was about to pay off in a major way. The first Corsair skill is called Elemental Boost, a passive skill that increased the potency of Flamethrower and Ice Splitter. While these skills would certainly become marginally less useful as the Corsair became stronger, this was a nice little bonus, and it could be a high priority skill depending on what build the Corsair chose. Another passive that only serves to buff a previous job advancement's skill is Wrath of the Octopi. This allows the Corsair to summon additional octopi, the total number of which were only restricted by the skill's cooldown. This skill would also buff the damage and fire rate of the summon, which is an improvement that actually makes this octopus summon useful, downright good even. Its damage was just enough that if the Corsair used it effectively, they could actually see an increase in their DPS. Airstrike is a mini ultimate, similar to what magicians possess in 4th Job, but it was significantly weaker, hit far fewer enemies, and had a short cooldown between casts. It was a very low priority skill for a Corsair. Now we reach a Corsair's first really useful skill. Rapid Fire is the gun version of Bowmaster's Hurricane. That's really all there is to say about it. It even fires the exact same number of bullets per second as Hurricane fires arrows, 8.3 bullets per second. Battleship is the catalyst that allows Corsairs to cleanly beat every other class in single-target DPS, contending only with Night Lords and outright beating them under specific circumstances. Battleship functions like a mount. The player hops in and their movement is restricted, but they're allowed to use a couple very powerful skills while on this battleship. Considered one of the most powerful skills in the game, competing with Night Lord's triple throw and beating it out in cool factor if you ask me, is Battleship Cannon. This is a skill that requires the Corsair to be on their ship, and it fires 4 bullets that deal 380% damage at max level. These bullets are fired very quickly, beating out 3rd Job's burst fire, but still losing out to double shot in terms of pure attack speed. However, when you consider that Battleship Cannon fires 4 bullets and double shot only fires 2, Battleship Cannon still technically wins in terms of bullets per second. It's tough to overstate how powerful Battleship Cannon is. If it wasn't for a Corsair exclusive mechanic that we haven't discussed yet, they'd be a major threat to Night Lord's single-target DPS dominance. Battleship Torpedo is the other skill that requires the player be on their ship. It's a strong, single-line mobbing skill that hits up to 6 enemies at once. It's really good and becomes way better as the Corsair reaches very high levels and gears up significantly, but it takes a while to really reach that point. We find another Corsair exclusive concept in Hypnotize. This skill will, at a set chance, hypnotize a monster, making them attack for the Corsair for up to 40 seconds. This is a neat skill conceptually, but unfortunately, it doesn't have that much use with the way MapleStory is designed. The final skill a Corsair has access to is Bullseye. This is a passive that increases the capabilities of 3rd Job's homing beacon. Bullseye will, on top of targeting a single enemy, also give 20% bonus damage against that enemy only for the Corsair, which is nutty when you think about it. Generally, Corsairs are bossing machines, and they can get started pretty early on, even though they don't tend to come online until they've maxed a couple skills, or at least gotten a few points in them. First, Battleship is given a single level almost always. What, you're gonna grind to Corsair and not immediately hop on your ship? If a player has Battleship Cannon and a level of Rapid Fire, they can actually start bossing pretty early on. This even helps with solo bossing, so it's a pretty common route that most Corsairs take. The concept is basically to max all of their bossing skills and then start killing whatever bosses they can find. What's most interesting though is Battleship and how it functions. This unique mechanic, one of many that Corsairs had, is their most iconic skill by miles, and it holds the key to their insane damage output. Unfortunately, Battleship in its first iteration had a major design flaw that effectively limited it to never being leveled beyond 1. Because leveling Battleship would originally increase its cooldown once it broke, most players simply never leveled it beyond level 1, where its cooldown was at its lowest. Wait, Togain, Battleship can break? A Corsair's Battleship has a set amount of HP that decreases as the player takes damage. When this value reaches 0, the ship breaks, forcing the Corsair out of it, and the skill then goes on cooldown. The formula that determines the HP value of the ship was very flawed in its initial implementation. It would only increase the amount of HP that the ship had by 4,000 per skill level, whereas 2 levels on the Corsair would increase the ship's total HP by that same amount while avoiding the added cooldown time associated with leveling the skill directly. A cooldown that would in turn effectively lower a Corsair's DPS over time. This mechanic is one of the largest factors that prevents Corsairs from overtaking Night Lords on the DPS charts. When a Corsair is off of their ship, they are effectively dealing very low damage, and it's not feasible to avoid all damage while bossing. A skilled Corsair will be able to dismount their ship before a powerful attack, avoiding damage and keeping it alive for far longer than a lower-leveled amateur Corsair, but there was a limit to how much a player could mitigate this damage. Even the best Corsairs in the game would eventually lose their ship in an extended boss fight. When not on their ship, the best DPS a Corsair can hope for is just using rapid fire and throwing down their octopus summons as frequently as possible. As the game was updated in the old school era, this higher cooldown per level would be removed, and by version 99 post Big Bang, the entire ship HP mechanic was removed, unleashing a Corsair's full power by never requiring them to dismount their ship. Another aspect of the game that Pirates streamlined was gear progression. In Old School MapleStory, Pirates are the only job to exclusively use overalls as their armor for every level bracket. Even when Timeless armor was released, this was still the case. Because of this, plus the low attack value on guns, Corsairs were often looking to acquire the highest stat-increasing overall available to them. There was a sweet spot, which was usually the White Marquini that only required 90 strength and could easily contribute enough bonus strength for the Corsair to be able to reach the 120 that they needed to equip the Timeless Blindness, the highest level gun. Overalls beyond this point were not highly recommended, as the strength requirement was simply too high to justify their use. You can't get the bonus strength required to equip a Timeless Blindness from your overall if the overall itself already required the same amount of strength to equip. This is what we call redundant items. This means no fussing with tops and bottoms and attempting to min-max that setup. Corsair skills received perhaps more changes than any other class in the game during the late Old School era. Numbers were adjusted, battleship was buffed, and Corsairs even saw their minimum distance requirement removed after version 86. All of these changes were great, and they had a hand in reaching the end result of making Corsairs even stronger than they already were. So, let me now discuss the age-old question that's burning in everyone's mind. How does a Corsair stack up against a Night Lord in terms of DPS? Well, interestingly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, depending on how familiar you are with Old School MapleStory, Corsairs provide higher DPS under a variety of circumstances, theoretically. If the party has no Sharp Eyes or Speed Infusion buffs, Corsairs will often outdamage equally powerful Night Lords. That's pretty straightforward. If the party has Speed Infusion but no Sharp Eyes, Corsairs still win, as they actually benefit from the attack speed increase that Speed Infusion brings, since they normally only reach 3 attack speed. Night Lords, on the other hand, always reach the attack speed cap of 2 with their claws and claw booster. If you add Sharp Eyes to the mix, Corsairs are still stronger than Night Lords in theory. Speed Infusion and Sharp Eyes both contribute to their damage, while Night Lords will only benefit from Sharp Eyes. Now, if you take away Speed Infusion, that's the one scenario where Night Lords easily win, even if the Corsair's ship never breaks. As you can see, there are plenty of scenarios where a Corsair will easily outdamage a Night Lord, right? The major issue with this theory is that the only scenario that you often find in Old School MapleStory bossing is a party with an archer who has Sharp Eyes. Speed Infusion and Buccaneers as a whole are pretty niche and not frequently found in optimal party setups. It's also very uncommon to run a boss without a Night Lord, and every Night Lord on Earth wants to have an archer with Sharp Eyes in the party. So, While Corsairs are superior in a number of scenarios, the one scenario that matters and occurs most often is the one instance where they're beaten by Night Lords. Despite this, Corsairs will often come out on top with their cheaper gear, allowing them to surpass a Night Lord's gear progression very early on. Of course, the further you get into endgame, the more this doesn't matter. What this means overall, though, is that Corsairs are kings of solo bossing, right up there with bowmasters and marksmen. Their lack of reliance on another class for a buff to unlock their potential damage output means they can join a party without Sharp Eyes or Speed Infusion and still deal 83% of their potential damage. Night Lords without Sharp Eyes only deal about half of their potential damage, for reference. Corsairs are stronger under perfect conditions, but these perfect conditions are uncommon at best and also boss dependent. Night Lords will have a much easier time in Horntail, for example. Horntail is a boss who frequently dishes out attacks that are not telegraphed in any way, meaning a Corsair will likely not have time to dismount their ship before an attack to avoid Horntail damaging it. A Corsair's lack of reliance on other classes gives them versatility that Night Lords don't have, and since they're one of the few classes with a skill-based mechanic, Corsair is often seen as one of the most well-respected classes in the game. Obviously, Night Lord still has a lot going for them despite this, so they're still the kings of Old School MapleStory, even if they lose out in DPS to the Chad Corsair from time to time. I think they'll be okay. This concept of theoretical damage output versus practical damage output is very common in MMOs, and it's fueled this debate of Corsair versus Night Lord, one that has raged on for years. Even to this day, most people don't fully understand which of the two is the stronger class. You go Night Lord if you want the easiest, safest route possible that almost always guarantees you'll be top single target DPS in any bossing scenario. You don't have to worry about your ship breaking, you can stand there and hold triple throw while asking for Sharp Eyes every couple of minutes. You'll enjoy higher avoidability and have access to Alchemist, one of the most powerful skills in the game, and nobody will ever question your ability to deal damage. You're a Night Lord, a known quantity in the OSMS space. However, if you want to stand out and be entirely independent, if you want to impress people and show off your ship dismounting skills while making Night Lord mains insecure solely with your presence, Corsair is the class for you. The story of Corsair is a story of perseverance that ultimately pays off in one of the most valuable, tangible forms possible in this old MMO: very high damage output. Other classes who struggle in their own ways will likely never have a major payoff at any point in their career. Certainly not in the form of independent top-tier single-target DPS like what Corsairs enjoy. Corsairs are known to be the kings of Crimsonwood Forest, effortlessly dispatching any Bigfoot or Headless Horseman they come across. High-level Corsairs are a force to be reckoned with, a class who thrives in bossing and holds their own in mobbing scenarios. Corsairs don't need a Sharp Eyes mule by their side at all times. They don't have to utilize a puppet to distract and pull aggro. Corsairs do everything on their own, independent of anyone else. If you find one in your bossing party, just remember that you need that Corsair way more than they need you. Hey, thanks for watching. Before we end this video, I want to give a quick shout out to my supporters on Patreon and YouTube, as well as a special thank you to Big Country, who has donated so much money, it's ridiculous. If you want to support me, one of the best ways to do so is through Patreon or YouTube membership. You'll get a special role in my Discord server, access to my video schedule, and exclusive monthly update videos that I make, informing everyone what I'm working on and what's going on, as well as my eternal thanks for allowing me to do what I love.